Hello, everyone. Thank you for tuning in again for this episode of the Amazing Podcast. I'm Twain Taylor, editor at amazing.com. And if you like what you listen to in this podcast, definitely go and check out our website, amazic.com, because we've got a whole lot more than this happening there. We've got articles and event coverages. We visit the KubeCons and many of the other industry conferences as well, Hashi Days, HashiConf, and different other tech conferences in the space. So you'll definitely like what you see there. And today I've got with me a really interesting guest who's from one of the startup companies in the space. And I have with me Jim Bugwadia, who is the co-founder and CEO at Nirmata. Jim, it's great to have you with us. Thanks for joining.
Thanks for having me, Train. Pleasure to be here.
All right, all right. So, Jim, if you could get us started talking about just the name Nirmata, it sounds quite interesting and unique for the name of a company. How did you come up with this name and what does it mean?
Yeah. Yeah, so what Nirmata means creator or director or sometimes maker in Indo-Aryan languages. And the meaning behind it, of course, we think of ourselves individually as builders, as people who are creative, making things, but also the software we produce, acts as a control management and control plane for clusters, cloud native workloads. So we thought it was a good fit. And of course, as with any business names goes, domain availability, things like that, and some being something, unique and memorable was very important, right?
All right, all right. Yeah, we're going to get into a bit of that and see how this name actually plays out in your product. But before we do that, I'd like to get to know you a bit. So if you could tell us about your journey so far, your experience, the companies you worked with briefly, and just how you got to even founding Nirmata.
Absolutely. So I'm a software engineer, still fairly active and hands-on with software development. I started my career, so from an education perspective, I studied at the University of Illinois. Did my master's degree there. Then worked, starting my career in the telecom network management space. So I worked at Motorola, where it was fairly exciting because I was part of this team that deploys the world's first ever CDMA cellular telephony system. I was writing C++ code at that time. And it was fascinating that, to me, coming from a theoretical sense of how software was built, seeing that software played a important role in things like telephony, right? Making phone calls. And it's just amazing to see how much is required even to orchestrate and manage a single call flow, handoffs, things like that. So love that domain and space. And also, ended up working at Lucent Bell Labs for a few years. But after a while, I got a little bit, bored of that telecom domain. So I was looking at what else is going on in the software space. And of course, all of the interesting action it seemed like was happening on the West Coast in Silicon Valley. So moved out to California in the late 90s, early 90, like it was 99, and worked at several different startups, kind of building products, leading teams. Eventually was at Cisco where I ran a cloud consulting team. And after that, myself, my co-founders, Ritesh, Damien, we had all known each other for several decades by then, worked at different places together. And, I remember around 2013 is when we first heard of Docker, and this was before it kind of exploded and became very popular. We saw for the first, demo that we saw of Docker was in a small meetup, about 20 people in Palo Alto, where I think the early team, Solomon and Jerome and others were showcasing the technology, and really saw it as a game changer for application development, but our interest was in application management, right? So we kind of, knew that containers would become the right way to package application, but we were also interested in the overall orchestration management. And of course, if we fast forward a few years from there, Kubernetes emerged. Kubernetes became that de facto orchestration standard, if you will, of containers. And today it's far beyond just containers. But that, led us to where we are. So initially we started more as a consulting play, around, containerization, microservices, built a little bit of tooling, explored the market. Around 2017, 2018 is when we went all in into Kubernetes and, kind of evolved into where we are today.
Oh, really curious. Really, really interesting that you were there right at the start of Docker and just being part of that journey right there physically. That's quite special. Um, and there's another, open source project as well that seems to be kind of the foundation of Nirmata, which we should talk about right at the start, which is Kyverno.
Yes.
And could you tell us a bit more about Kyverno? And so I think the same folks that, you guys that founded Nirmata either wrote the code for Kyverno itself or were part of the journey at some point. I don't know if you could kind of shed some light on that.
Sure, happy to. Yeah, so Kyverno came out of our product at Nirmata, right? So it's interesting because most open source businesses, they start with an open source project, maybe they incubate it at a larger company, and once that gets enough traction, then they kind of think of building a commercial business around it. We already had, a fairly successful business. We were and Kyverno was one of the modules, one of the services. At that time, it was just part of our platform that we had built for Kubernetes management. We had built this policy and governance module as part of it. As Kubernetes matured, we saw the opportunity to move Kubernetes completely or move Kyverno into the control plane. By the way, Kyverno it means to govern in Greek, so it kind of fits in again with this whole policy governance, which is what we are looking at, and providing guardrails for platform teams. So yeah, around like Kubernetes, I think it was 1.15, 1.16, as it matured, it had finally all the features that were required to run admission controllers at scale within these clusters. So we took Kyverno out of our, commercial offering, open sourced it. After a few months, we donated it to CNCF, and that became, the admission controller, the project that we know of today. So Kyverno, we donated to CNCF, and it's now part of the community. It's become, popular or maybe even the de facto policy engine for Kubernetes for a few reasons. Kyverno is not just about, given our operations and management background, it's not just about validation, enforcement, and security, but it also helps you automate specific use cases, which are also very critical, by the way, to security, right? So that we saw as a missing piece in the whole ecosystem. And at that time, other technologies like Open Policy Agent, which uses a language called Rego, they already existed. So we carefully evaluated that, but we did see a major gap in the space, which is where we introduced Kyverno. And today, Kyverno has about like something like 2.7 billion downloads. We're tracking to about 4.6K GitHub stars, very exponential growth in the project. We just applied for CNCF graduation, so super excited and humbled by, kind of the success and the wide adoption of the project there.
Wow, amazing. And so with all of this adoption for Kyverno, has that had any impact on the direction for Nirmata itself and your product? Has Kyverno kind of taken center stage in your product development, or has it still been just one part of your overall product and your offering is quite independent of Kyverno?
No, so the two are very, well correlated. So
Mhm.
we, having seen other domains, grow, we knew that at some point, even for Kubernetes and cloud native, there's a natural evolution from management and things like provisioning, which tend to become commodity over time, right? Into governance. So we always knew that the journey, the path for us was to start with the basics of, because there's a point in time need, and going back to like let's say about 2017, 2018, folks were still trying to struggle with, okay, how do I bring up my first Kubernetes cluster, right? That had a lot of complexity. Of course, folks like Kelsey and others in the community wrote things like about Kubernetes the hard way to explain how each component works. Today, you can go to any major cloud provider, you can download several distributions where all of that is abstracted away, right? Even for workload, monitoring, visibility, management, those have become simplified. There's several tools to help manage or deal with that as well. So we knew that evolution would happen. In some ways in this space, and perhaps it's every cycle of technology, every wave of technology, we see that evolution happening faster and faster. But that transition from management to governance is inevitable. So for us, Kiverno just really strengthened that conviction that we were on the right track. It was the right evolution, and we are completely focused around providing, a governance platform around Kiverno, powered by Kiverno. And by the way, at the last KubeCon, we also announced Kiverno for non-Kubernetes workloads, because the same platform teams that manage Kubernetes also happen to manage things like infrastructure as code pipelines, CI/CD tooling, serverless, other container services. So the common ask from our customers was, how do I manage all of this with a single unified policy and governance solution, which is what we're delivering.
Wow. Okay, really cool. I wanted to kind of segue into talking a bit about the security aspect of this all. You mentioned the complexity with Kubernetes and how that's being abstracted, which is a good thing. But then I guess there's still a lot of operational complexities that come, along the way as you manage and operate it at scale. But also there's, because of that, there are issues around security. And I saw an interesting idea on, well, looking through your website, something called shift down security. And I was curious to know about that. What does that mean, shift down security? And we've heard of shift left. We talk a lot about shift left, but shift down, I'm hearing that for the first time. So I want to hear you talk about this angle of what does all this mean for security and what is shift down security?
Yeah. Yeah, so starting with, this intersection of operations and security is fascinating, first of all, to us. And we feel it's a much needed step in the industry, right? Because, going back to my telecom roots, their security is very well baked into every other operational process. And you almost have to have that for lights out 24/7 mission critical systems and managing huge networks, global networks at scale. That's almost required, right? In our IT and data center, cloud virtualization, those domains, it seems like security has always been an afterthought, right? It's somebody else's job, and that
Yeah.
doesn't work. That doesn't scale, right?
Mhm.
So, it's interesting, like you said, a lot of the traditional security vendors sort of message on, okay, well, we can't scale it as maybe on the far right. So how about we shift it far left? And that means, okay, as a poor developer, uh, I have several other things to do, several deadlines and pressures, but now I have to add one more thing and I have to become a security expert, which also doesn't work, right? So what we kind of look at and what we think of, and this is an evolution we're seeing in the cloud native space, there's this emergence of platform engineering. And platform engineering, some people think of it as an evolution of DevOps to DevSecOps to now platform engineering. But the very interesting thing here, and this is, proven from large companies or operating cloud native systems at scale, is to treat these internal platforms as products and to be able to, almost have the same engineering discipline that you would use for your end customer products for these internal platforms, right? So now when you kind of put this in perspective, when we say shift down security, we mean security needs to be baked into the platform. Without the guardrails, without the security, you don't have self-service. You can't provide self-service to developers and kind of let it be insecure, right? So that's the problem we're solving. And we believe that policy as code, along with other cloud native best practices, is the right and the only way to solve this. So hence we're focused on that. And we don't, we're not trying to compete with your any of the favorite four-letter acronyms in the security world, like CNAP or CSPM or whatever analysts come up with. We're more focused in how do we operationalize, automate security and best practices for platform engineering teams.
Mhm. Yeah, I think really interesting concept about treating your internal platform as a product. And so I think that kind of says that, the product itself should be independent of which vendor you use to build and maintain the product. That can change over. It should be technology agnostic, vendor agnostic, and that's quite interesting. And so, you know, yeah, and I think that would also have security implications, because then if you're building and maintaining a product that's going to be technology and vendor agnostic, then your security as well would need to be vendor and technology agnostic. Could you talk a bit about that? How does an organization go about building something like this? Sometimes when, they might even think they don't have what it takes to do that, and they're just trying to, keep things afloat.
Right.
Just they're trying to meet some business objectives, and if they can do that, they're happy. And now, this seems more complex if they're to manage a whole product with thinking about, how do they make it future proof, and how do they make it work with all of these changing the technology landscape. It sounds challenging. What would you say
Right.
to someone in that
Yeah.
situation?
Yeah, that's a good point, right? And there is like, look, if you're a team of, let's say 15, 20 developers embarking, if you're building a new startup, at a younger stage of your evolution, this is not, you shouldn't be building a platform, right? You should be using an existing platform, most likely a managed, cloud provider service. Just focus on your business value, right? If you
Mhm.
are a team of that has like mid to large enterprises with thousands of developers, several different business units, several perhaps infrastructure, like some of the companies we work with, these are Fortune 50s. They have deployments across multiple clouds, edge, and several other things, right? There you have different types of needs, you have different challenges, because if all of your developers are going to now the cloud, and learning, and if your business strategy shifts from one vendor to another, you have to retool, kind of build everything. So a lot of these, if you see why are these businesses adopting Kubernetes, and who's adopting Kubernetes, because everything you said can also be said for Kubernetes. Kubernetes is not for the faint of heart, because there
Mhm.
is complexity in it, right? And there's complexity for a good reason, because it solves a lot of complex problems and because of the flexibility it provides. So, given that, for mid to large enterprises, the Fortune 2000, the Global 5000, they require things like Kubernetes. The days of locking into a single, platform vendor or a single security vendor are gone, because none of these vendors are going to keep up with the pace of open source and the community and the way things evolve here, right? So what's happening is these are the companies that are composing their own platform. They don't have to build it all themselves, but they can, look at what's happening in the Cloud Native Compute Foundation, in CNCF, take best in class projects, and start seeing how do I compose my platform on Kubernetes. So the beauty of Kubernetes is it's not designed for something that end users consume, or even developers. So developers do consume some APIs in Kubernetes, but it's not, the platform is not meant to be delivered in its raw form to developers, right? It's meant to be the platform of platforms, where you build your own internal tooling by picking and choosing the right add-ons, and everything, if done correctly. And the reason why we feel we have been successful with Kyverno is not just the policy language and the policy engine, but even managing other, artifacts around policies, like reports, like, exception management, things like that, is all done through native Kubernetes APIs, because Kubernetes is designed to be extensible and plug in these workflows into it. So that, going back to your question, at the right size, and there is a tipping point, businesses need to decide, at what point do I have, I can no longer afford to just lock in to a single vendor. I want to go with a more composable, extensible, play where I can pick and choose the best in class components and be able to, build my own platform for internal use.
Mhm, mhm. All right, all right. Yeah, so sounds like, we touched on a bunch of important points already in this conversation, talking about what does shift down security mean and how, security should be baked into the platform, treating the platform as a product. And even spoke just now about just the different stages that organizations are at in this whole journey. And I think there's just one more point that I wanted to touch on before we talk a bit more about Nirmata itself, which is about governance and more practically policies and the role that they play in implementing governance in an organization. Could you talk about, you even mentioned OPA and how Kyverno
Mhm.
integrates with OPA, and yeah, if you could talk a bit on those lines from security, talking now about governance. What do you see related to governance that organizations, the challenges they face, and some of the solutions that you've seen work as you've spoken to your customers?
Right. So just one quick clarification, Kyverno does not use OPA. We, are alternative to OPA. In fact,
Oh,
with several of our customers, we are in the process of replacing OPA Gatekeeper with Kyverno, right? Because again, if you're building on top of Kubernetes, Kyverno is a simpler and in an option which also addresses a lot more use cases. Like, for example, if you're able to mutate as well as generate resources for supply chain security. So Kyberno is just a broader set of use cases for Kubernetes. But yeah, to your question on governance and where that fits, and that's a very interesting topic, right? And something we actually, so I co-chair in the Kubernetes policy working group within the CNCF. We wrote a paper on this topic because policy is a building block, right? It's a means to an end. You can, and just maybe to even define that further, right? So in our real life, we all work for some business or organization where you might have things like a vacation policy and it's a document somebody wrote somewhere. Now, in our context, in cloud native and in the IT world, in the digital world, a policy is some artifact that's typically, you'd written as a set of declarations, but you want to, with policy as code best practices, you want to manage that through version control. You want testing for the policy. You want rollout and provisioning for the policy, much like you would with your software, right? And the interesting thing is, if you make your policy easily understandable to all stakeholders, so a system like Kubernetes has multiple teams, multiple stakeholders. It has the operations team, it has the security team, and then, of course, your developers. Now, if the policy is not understandable or easily accessible to all of these, it won't work. It won't scale, right? Because all of these stakeholders, it's kind of like this mutual contract that you're agreeing to and that you're seeing across these. So we felt it was very important, first of all, to make sure policy is completely, accessible to all of the stakeholders involved in the process, right? And then the second thing is now once you decide on a policy, what is the goal of it is to govern your systems, and governance really, again, it's a broader term, but what it means is everything operating according to policy? So now you're setting your policies at a high level. Simple example, like you're saying my pods must have, should not kind of expose a root user. And once I set that policy, and that is related to, if you go look at the maybe the NSA Kubernetes hardening guidelines or, NIST 853, all of them will talk about pod security in some of these policies. Now, to govern and to say is like which one of my clusters are in compliance, which are out of compliance, and how do I, like you talked about, I want to bake that into my platform itself. So anytime a new user asks for a cluster or a namespace, it's secure by default. I don't have to go and manually configure anything, manage anything else. I just want to automate that as part of my flow. That's the whole spirit of being cloud native, right? So we kind of think of it as three steps. So being cloud native means you want to codify everything possible, you want to automate everything possible, and then you want to collaborate. So you want to collaborate across DevSecOps. If you achieve those three things, you're kind of on your way, to being, more cloud native than some of the systems of the past. But yeah, on the governance layer here is really, and the governance could be, feeding into regulatory compliance, could be internal standards, but it's making sure things are working according to policy. And also it relates to cost and resource management, right? So policies are not just for security, but could be for operations, could be for best practices, could be for other guardrails, could be as simple as, hey, we want to prefer all of our S3 buckets are created in US East because that's, where most of our customers are, right? Whatever that policy might be, once you put it in place, governing across these clusters becomes important, and that's the next layer of business value on top.
Okay, okay. Wow, that's a really detailed response with a lot of juicy, tidbits that we want to get into in just a bit. So we've kind of set the stage. We've spoken about Kubernetes and uh, talked about the security issues around it and governance as well just now. If you can tell us now, what does Nirmata do in regards to this? What's the elevator pitch for Nirmata?
Sure. So Nirmata, is we automate security compliance for Kubernetes and cloud native workloads, right? We do that. It's powered through Kyverno. So Kyverno is our policy engine. Like we were talking about, we are the ones who created and we maintain it within the CNCF, along with the community, of course. And but we also leverage Kyverno heavily for a lot of these use cases for, again, not just best practices, but also for automation of some of these, right? So the type of value that Nirmata provides, and happy to kind of show a quick demo where how we would provide this layer, and also just starting with the in-cluster experience, because again, we're perhaps one of the only vendors who will tell customers you don't have to use our UI to see value, right? We're happy if customers go to kubectl, they go to other UIs, it's perfectly fine, right? And that's the whole kind of spirit of being composable, of being extensible, and trying to minimize lock-in. There's always, look, every product will have some degree of lock-in, but we've architected and done our best to, kind of minimize that as much as possible.
Mhm, mhm. Yeah, and there are a bunch of use cases that I've seen for Nirmata. But if you can kind of walk us through it,
Sure.
just a little demo of what it looks like using Nirmata. I'd love to discuss some of the features of Nirmata.
Sure. Happy to do that. Yeah, so this is our dashboard. But before I kind of dive into the dashboard and what Nirmata does, just want to kind of show, and set the context for Kubernetes, especially from a security perspective of what it means to install, run, and manage Kyverno or any policy engine, within the cluster itself, right? So here on my command line, if I kind of I'll just do kubectl get namespace. This is a kind cluster I have installed locally. I already have Kyverno working. Kyverno is very simple to install. If you kind of just go into the community thing and our docs, there's several ways. There's a Helm chart or, kind of just through a single YAML command. It's very easy to install. It installs a number of different controllers. All of this is customizable. You can turn things on and off. So for example, if you don't want cleanup policies, you can turn that off. If you don't want reporting, you can turn off the reporting controller and so on, right? But
Mhm,
once, Kyverno is installed in my cluster, I can very easily, and notice over here again, I'm just doing standard tools, customize. I'm going to pull down a set of policies from this GitHub repo, and I'm applying them into my cluster, right? So before I do that, actually, I want to show what happens if you don't have policies, right? So let's look at that. So right now, if I say, who am I? I'm logged in as my username. If I say, where am I? I'm in my home directory. But let's see, and this is again default Kubernetes. By the way, this is the same even if you're using a managed Kubernetes service, any of the cloud providers. This is sort of what you get when you spin up a cluster, right? So at this point, if I do, kubectl run, and I'm going to use this one-liner. Let me make sure my screen wrap is correct. Whoops. Uh, so I'm going to use this one-liner with command, which what it does. Give me just a second. The Zoom toolbar is okay. What I want to do, there we go. So now you see the whole command. What this, let's clear that and take take a look. So what this command is doing is it's a one line, command which is running a pod, elevating privileges, basically doing a container breakout or container escape, right? And it's kind of mounting, your proc directory. And if I'm allowed to do this, not only I'm running a container on my system, but now if I do who am I, I'm root. If I do where am I, I'm at the root directory. And if I look over here, if I go to, let's say, /proc, I can see every process running. I can attach to a standard out. I can interact with everything on my host, right? So this is the default security posture you get for any cloud managed Kubernetes or any Kubernetes by default, right? So clearly not a good thing because it's fairly straightforward for somebody who knows what they're doing to, from a workload, if there's a vulnerability in your Python or Java or JavaScript app, they can break out into the container and from the container get to the host and do, some potentially bad things. So what can we do to fix that? And I'll just show you with Kyverno, I'm going to install now going back to these policies. I'm going to install a set of policies for pod security, right? And now if I do kubectl get cpol, what I see over here is there's a bunch of policies in enforce mode, which got put into my cluster. And at this point, if I try to run that same command again, I'm immediately blocked, and it tells me, why it's blocked. Says you can't run, with privilege as in privilege mode. You can't elevate privileges. Running as root is not allowed, and kind of you have to use seccomp for the highest levels of pod security over here, right? So very simple, but I think meaningful demo here because it shows you what the Kubernetes posture is and why policies are required. Now, some of this, you might have heard in Kubernetes, there was PSPs. PSPs got deprecated, then pod security admission was added. But pod security admission is an opt-in, right? So with any of these, again, Kubernetes clusters, unless you label your namespaces correctly, unless you set the default, policy for pod security admission, it's not going to apply by itself. So this is why proper configuration management and policy-based configuration management becomes essential for Kubernetes. This is again just a very simple example, and even if you kind of end up, you might say, hey, my security tool might fall for pod security. Well, what about workloads? What about best practices? What about other custom policies? Let's say you put in Istio. Istio needs to be secured. You are running Argo CD. How are you securing Argo CD, right? So all of these things need to be thought through, and the platform team again is the best set of champions for this level of security and expertise within the enterprise, right? So that's what, at a very high level, what Kyverno does. Going back to Nirmata, so this is kind of our dashboard. Here, if I kind of look in my Nirmata dashboard, I have several different clusters, some demo clusters. This is an account we use for demos attached. But now, very interestingly, I can go back into my policies and I can see policy reports across my cluster, across namespaces. So if I go into, one of these things and I can say, hey, maybe, here, like I'm running some operator or something like that. Maybe I'm running Loki. What are the things I need to do to harden Loki, right? So again, all of these are sort of best practices and there's, several different policies you might want to install and manage. And you can always, you can add like more policy sets. You can do this through GitOps. You can roll them out through Nirmata. And just taking a look at, what one of these policies might even look like. So it's very simple. Again, the whole idea here is to simplify. This is actually an integration with one of our partners, with Venafi, where we are, kind of, enforcing that all images are signed with with the key coming from this particular Venafi system, right? So just with this few lines of YAML in this configuration, now you're, well on your way towards improving your software supply chain security posture by verifying that images are signed and they're coming from a trusted source, they're not tampered with, etc. Right? So several other features, but hopefully this gives you a quick demo, quick overview of what some of the value points of Nirmata are, and how our customers end up using it.
Yeah, really neat. Thanks for that. Yeah, that was really helpful and quite engaging as well, that you showed us different parts of how the whole flow of how the product works in really simple ways. Yeah, that was really cool. And I want to ask just, YAML can get out of hand at times, and a lot of times even, developers themselves are not, as good at writing YAML, and a lot of people don't know how to write YAML. And so that being a challenge, does Nirmata help with that, just managing or even creating YAML easily at scale?
Yeah, so with our enterprise offerings, we do have a curated set of policies that we manage. We also do have a simplified, kind of a policy editor, which allows you to quickly, to start with a sample policy and then add a few things to it. In the community, we are over like 300 different sample policies on Kyverno. So pretty much anything you're trying to solve, it's just like with coding these days, right? You start with something that's somewhat similar, and then you tweak it and customize it to your needs. That's one thing. There are some interesting things we have played around. We don't think Gen AI is there quite yet, but we are playing around with technologies which help you with some of this, right? So stay tuned. We will be kind of talking about those in the future.
Mhm. Yeah, yeah. And yeah, and could you give us some examples of how of policies in action, in a day-to-day scenario? How can you set up things so that policies actually work in your favor? What does it look like when you have policies set up the way they should be set up? What are the benefits? Could you make it real for someone listening and interested more? How can they better use policies?
Absolutely, right? So the simple way of thinking about it is, again, and in platform engineering, there's this term called golden paths, right? So the idea is you're not trying to create gates and barriers and challenges for developers, or to slow down your developers or your end users, but you're trying to create these golden paths so that they can move faster but
Uh,
securely, right?
mhm,
One one example I kind of think about is, how, yeah, at least in the US, or maybe in, all major sort of, continents, if you go to a mall and there's this little play area for your kids, right? And it's somewhere like you have parents sitting on the side outside, but your kids are in there and they're playing with other kids. It's kind of like they're on their own. They feel independent, but they're in a well padded, well protected area, and somebody's watching, right? So that's in the real world, that's one form of governance. So you're creating those sort of golden paths on those secure sandboxes for your developers, for your dev teams, so they can't accidentally or inadvertently do something that leaks sensitive data or blows up their systems, or kind of causes other kind of bad things to happen, right? So like one good example of it in making it more concrete for our space is today, if you are working with Kubernetes, either you're going to want to get access to a cluster, or you're going to want to get access to a namespace, which is a slice of a cluster, right? So let's say, and you sometimes these are things called clusters as a service or namespace as a service, and the platform teams will deliver these internally as use cases to their end users. So let's say I'm using namespaces as a service. So if I get a raw namespace and I can create it through kubectl, I can do whatever I want in that namespace. There's no, boundaries, there's no guardrails. But if I create it through Nirmata with Nirmata policies in place for multi-tenancy, I get a quota by default. I can request, do I want a small namespace, large namespace? I want a custom setting, like maybe I want 64 GB, and now I get a namespace with a quota set. So I can do whatever I want up to that quota. But beyond that, so it'll tell me, hey, you're exceeding your quota. You cannot deploy this workload. Go talk to your admin, and they can right size and resize it for you. Now, interestingly, even like another form of configuration is, let's say I got 64 GB, right? And I self-service, so there's nothing in my way. I allocated it, but I'm not using it, which is again a very common problem with every enterprise. I'm maybe using barely, I've used 2 GB in the last month. How am I gonna, and if you want to do this manually, becomes extremely difficult to go and tell somebody that, hey, this namespace is underutilized, or this is, should be reprovisioned. With policies, you can automate a lot of these things, right? Not only do you set up your secure guardrails, but you automate the checks. If there's stale resources, and cleanup policies can clean these up. If there's things crashing, you can get an alert. So the whole point is to kind of go to these self-driving, autonomous type systems, which are self-managing, self-cleaning, and optimized based on, the available resources and capacity. But yeah, some very simple these use cases, which are, as we're consuming things, to have these type of security things, and to keep them as invisible as possible. So you don't have to think about it unless you bump into it, right? Or unless you see that barrier.
Mhm, mhm. Really interesting. Golden paths, and really kind of talks about how design matters, and you can design it so that things are secure by default. Again, tying into that previous idea of how do you shift down security. And I think that's definitely what organizations should be moving towards. But I want to ask about the other side of this, which is, despite all of the design, all of the architecture, and all of that, there's bound to be instances where uh, you know things happen. Like there's privilege escalation that could happen, or there could be an accidental exposure of a secret, or some data. And in those cases, how can policies be used to respond to
Right.
these situations? And what are some of the ways that you found that you baked into your product itself, and how policies can help with the response in these situations?
Mhm. Yeah, so policies, first of all, are not trying to replace runtime security or the need to kind of, detect attacks and things like that, right? You still need your security tools, and the security team should be responsible for managing this. What we are doing is today, a typical security team is over inundated by either misconfigurations, false positives, things which they don't have the bandwidth to manage, right? So what we're doing is kind of freeing up security teams to focus on what's really important, which are these type of, if somebody is doing a runtime attack, and typically after you understand what that is looking like, maybe you can come up with a policy to mitigate it in the future, but you're not going to stop what's already in motion. It means there was something which was exposed, or some configuration you allowed, which perhaps should have been blocked, right? So I think the right way to think of these tools are they're very complementary to each other. So just like when we talk about shift left security, it doesn't mean that the security team can pack up their bag and go home. They're still needed, right? They still have a lot of work to do. It just means you're saying, hey, others have to be exposed and also take care of security. Here we're saying, look, shift left doesn't work. It doesn't scale. I mean, maybe for certain things it's fine, but for these complex systems like Kubernetes, cloud native, you need to bake this into the platform, and that will help your security team. In fact, one interesting dynamic we're seeing is that security, our product is either, directly championed and paid for by the ops and platform teams, or in some cases, it is the security team that says, platform team, take a look at this, and if you like it, we're going to pay for it because we can't keep up with all this other stuff, right? And just seeing the findings, if I see 5,000 findings or all of these in my, CNAP, what's the point? It's too late, right? All of this is already misconfigured. How am I even going to talk to developers to know what to do? Right? So that's the value that we bring, but we're not trying to replace what you need for, some of these other tooling or other runtime detection and enforcement.
Got it, got it, got it. As we wind down, Jim, I want to ask about just, what are some of the initial remarks that you hear when someone starts using Nirmata? What are some of the first impressions and results that they see? How long does it take to see this?
Yeah, so our internal benchmark is we want, our customers to see time to value in under 5 minutes, right? And today,
Right.
all of us live in such a busy world. We're all inundated by so many different things. If you're not seeing that immediate value, then it's, you're not going to kind of, further pursue. And because we're an open source company, our initial value point is through our open source, right? So our end customers tend to be people who are, either already consuming or in the process of consuming our open source software, and then are looking at either adding more or scaling more with that. So clearly, and then certainly we have a lot more work to be done as the industry keeps evolving. As and today it's super exciting to see just from the last KubeCon and AWS reInvent, which just happened. And Kubernetes now is becoming the de facto way to run even AI ML workloads. So how do you do governance policies for those is a big wide open question. There's always new use cases coming up and things, so we continue to sort of innovate in those directions as well.
Very neat. The last question I have for you, Jim, is when you look ahead the next 1 to 2 years, what do you see lying ahead in terms of governance and security and policies, Kubernetes, and what are you most excited about? Any developments on this front?
Yeah, so what is exciting to us and what we still have work to be done collectively as a community, as an industry. So just like Kubernetes, many people have said Kubernetes should disappear. We believe, security ideally at some point should be not so much front end center, should disappear or go into the background where it's just baked into systems, right? So to me, that would be an exciting thing to see, where it becomes boring. It's like, why wouldn't it's so easy to do? Why wouldn't it be secure, right? Why would you even think about something else? And we've seen that happen, right? We've seen like tools like Let's Encrypt and others have done that in the security space for certain segments. We believe we can do that in a broader space, and that's what gets us excited at Nirmata, bringing that, to the community and to the rest of the industry.
Wow, that definitely sounds exciting if it could happen. Security is actually an afterthought in a good way. That's a great note to finish on. But before you go, Jim, I want to get to know you a bit. I got a couple of questions to ask you about yourself.
Okay.
So here goes. Uh, Actually, the question that I ask all of my guests is I start off with is asking about if not for your job in tech, what would be your alternate career path? So yeah, what would it be?
Um, I probably something related to tech, but as a kid, I always wanted to be. I kind of am fascinated by like like I wanted to be a pilot because I love, just the amount of complexity that goes into it, and just seeing that somebody, a couple of people can, manage these amazing machines and, kind of help it, travel and things like that. So that, certainly at some point, I feel that that's aviation and those type of things are always fascinating to me, but more from a pursuit or from a hobby perspective than other things. Yeah.
All right, cool, cool. So what's something that you found out after being CEO that you didn't know before?
One interesting thing that was a learning to me, I can't say I didn't know of it before, but didn't realize how important it was, is just the simplicity and crispness and communication, and like the amount of gaps that there might be, right? Because what you think you said is probably not what the other person heard.
Mhm.
And there's all of us come with our own sort of nuance and our own thought process. So it's that, ability, and I, really admire people who make this seem very easy. But also have come to respect that there's a lot of hard work that goes into making it seem easy. Is that ability to communicate effectively well, simplify messages, and really kind of, how to steer organizations, communities, and thought across, our collective sense.
Right, all right, really interesting. Yeah, yeah, yeah. And I think from what I just heard, I think you're doing great at really communicating complex things in a simple way. So yeah, kudos.
Thank you.
Um, yeah, follow up probably to the previous question is, you know, being CEO, you mentioned communication as one aspect, but you actually have to wear multiple hats, especially a tech CEO. You get to kind of do a bit of development, you get to do thinking about marketing, thinking about the product development, sales, all of that, right? Finance. But which of these roles really resonates, and which do you really enjoy and you feel like you're in your element when you're doing that role?
Yeah, so a couple of things come to mind. So I still enjoy and love coding. I love to build things. So software development is always, and I feel will always continue to be a passion for me. But maybe even more fulfilling than that, if that, and maybe 10 years ago, I wouldn't have thought something like that. I would say something which was, even more fulfilling than building technology. Developing and building teams and seeing the growth in people you're working with, right? So seeing folks that, and again, at Nirmata, we have folks that, with a wide range of experience, but building that next set of leaders in the community, thought leaders, people who are empowered, it's amazingly fulfilling, right? And there's no feeling like that to see others succeed, and having played some small part in it, is amazing.
Mhm. Wow, really interesting to hear that. That's really amazing. Talking about that transition from just your love for tech to you realizing your love for building teams. Quite a transition. Uh, yeah, that's a great response. I want to ask about. Could you name one software tool or product that you think is very elegantly built?
So on the software side, yeah, I think, just I was thinking about, just based on recent travel, even, it's a simple example, but I usually fly United Airlines. Their app is pretty nice at keeping you updated, giving you checks, things like that. Somebody put a lot of thought and process into it, right? And I was kind of admiring like that, it's very timely. It gives you the right information at the right time without trying to be too intrusive or getting in your way. So that comes to mind. But yeah, there's several, of course, tech companies that stand out, like, of course, Apple for its design, kind of innovation, elegance. Big fan of Tesla in terms of how they innovate across everything they do, right? Not even though you could kind of complain about a few little things in their cars and things like that, just amazing to see the amount of innovation they're built into the manufacturing process, other things. So Yeah, several great examples.
Mhm. Wow, very cool. Last question for you, Jim, is what's your favorite source for finding out what's new and happening right now in the space?
It's still mostly, I think, in the Kubernetes community, it's X, formerly known as Twitter. So I think that still tends to be the prevalent platform where, and it's interesting, right? At a point not too long ago, I used to use like news aggregators and news feeds, but seems like, X or Twitter now, uh, that's where you find information almost immediately. And LinkedIn is also, it seems like again, as some folks moved off of Twitter, LinkedIn, like the tech space in there, there's some good content and other things. But between those two, those seem like the quickest way to get information.
Yeah, that's cool. Yeah, Twitter, you need some filters there, though. It's
Right.
quite a firewall.
Yes, there's a lot of spam in there, and that seems to have increased too in the recent months for sure.
Yeah. Well, it was a pleasure chatting with you, Jim. Thanks so much for joining us. And yeah, we hope to chat soon again with you.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me, Twain.
And to all of our listeners, thanks for tuning in. And if you're interested in knowing more about Nirmata, then definitely check out their website. And if security, governance, policies is on your mind, then you definitely want to see what Nirmata is up to. So tune in again next week, and we'll be having another guest on the show talking about another solution. We hope you enjoyed this talk. See you next time. Bye bye.